Well, welcome everybody to our April Stories and Organization Story Lab. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Artem, who's going to unmute himself so he can introduce this month's speaker that we're very excited to have with us. And then before we start, I just want to welcome everybody who's on the call and others who are going to be dialing in later to listen to our recording. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Jules. It's Artem from the board of the Storytelling in Organizations group. And I would like to present our speaker today with a short story. So a couple of weeks ago, I've actually been talking to a client of mine, an HR director, and she was asking me to organize a webinar. And I asked her, so how many participants are going to be there? And she said, looking me straight in the eye, oh, so 2 years ago, we had a different option of inviting people, and we gathered a crowd of around 100 people. But then COVID started and we changed the system, and she went on and on and on with this story. And I was like, oh my God, woman, give me the number. And I was feeling this urge, like I love stories. I crave storytelling. I love turning people into storytellers. But then again, why do you tell the story now? What's the purpose of it? And after that, Jules sent me a video of a TED Talk by Brian, our today's guest, on answer intelligence. And I think Brian is a very, very fitting guest because we storytellers tend to use stories for everything. And I believe they have their own place. And luckily for us, Brian Glibkowski has his own method of his own answer intelligence typology, which basically includes stories into it. So Brian will share with us on his research as an author and researcher of the possibilities of different answers. So Brian, thank you so much for joining. It's all yours, and rock and roll.
Thank you, Artem. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks for everyone joining today. So what I've prepared are some slides to go through, a couple of points maybe to stop and get some interaction. But if any point you want to jump in, just jump in. Please don't use the emoji or the chat. I don't know if I'll be looking at that. And at the end, we can have an extended discussion. So, to add to my background, I've been in and out of academia. I did research on questions. We all know questions, 6 WH questions. Why, what, how, when, where, who, open and close questions. Coaching methodologies, sales methodologies are based on questions. So I really wanted to study the answer side of that equation and conducted some research with, I'll talk about the top golf instructors in the world and developed this answer framework. And I'll get into it in a second. But I will say story is one of the 6 answer types. So that's a way we can provide value. Another thing from your standpoint that I think might be interesting for you to think about is the idea of how story fits into all the answers. And that idea could be kind of interesting, and think about how story can extend to some of these other answer types I'm going to talk about. So we're going to go from there. So let me just jump into this, and I'll talk about the applications of this framework as I go forward. But this sort of underscores, I think, the need for this research, at least on a very superficial level. We have this typology of questions, but no typology of answers. And I wanted to develop a typology of answers. How many answer types are there? This is what I examined in some of my research. If you think of questions and answers, I think they serve different functions. So a question, you ask for curiosity, and an answer fills that void. So for example, if someone says, why should we follow you? Imagine you're a leader. Of course, we're going to answer with a story, right? A why question is answered with a story, for example. And when we provide that answer, we influence someone. So I think we all know this intuitively. Stories, as well as the other answer types, they provide influence. That effective story influences someone. So I'm going to show you my framework in a second here. My my goal for our little time together at the capital R is to, reimagine communication. And that's really extreme. That's like, starting at the top of the circle, going back to the beginning and understanding it for the first time. My goal is sort of lowercase r. Maybe we can make a little movement towards thinking about questions and answers and stories. And hopefully this is some value to you. I'll tell you an example. When I first was experimenting with my answer intelligence framework, one of the answer types is a metaphor. And I had a business project with where I was a consultant. I was working with the CEO of a company, and I wanted to bring in a third-party technologist. So all three of us had to work together. And I needed to convey to the CEO, my idea for what a partnership was. And I needed to, in this case, use a metaphor. So I was doing research in metaphors, and we all use metaphors, but oftentimes I don't think I use them purposely or sort of so deliberately. So I Googled on the internet partnership and ultimately settled on this metaphor of a three-legged stool. I thought it was a little bit, hokey, but I said, I'm going to try it. So I went to the executive and said, our partnership is like a three-legged stool. If all three of us don't work together, if one of us pulls out, the stool is going to fall down. Okay. And that's basically all I said. I bit my lip. I wasn't sure if that made sense. And it did, because a week later, the CEO, unprompted, returned that same metaphor back to me, the three-legged stool. This is one of the things you see with all answer types. Stories, people retell them. Metaphors, people will retell them. They travel. And I was like, wow, that's pretty exciting. And from there, I started to, really lean into what became this entire answer intelligence framework, 6 answers to different questions. And one thing that I was thinking about with the example of the metaphor was, for what reason did the metaphor work? I'm a professor, and I've had students that tell metaphors that aren't very good. And what makes a good metaphor from a bad metaphor? And one of the things I came up with is that an effective metaphor is tied to other answers you provide in the conversation, has credibility. So the three-legged stool metaphor sounded valid because I also shared with the CEO stories of how my technology partner I wanted to bring in had worked with others, right? I talked about theory or strategy, cause and effect logic that related to the CEO's business. I talked about, the concept of a partnership and defined it and talked about that a little bit. Then we talked about procedures and actions of how the partnership would work. What would the steps be? What would be the key actions? So in short, the metaphor worked because it was supported by all the other answer types, including story. So this was sort of the start of the journey for me, and looking at these different answer types. Let me pause here and see if anyone has any questions, and to give you a second to think about your questions. We're just getting started. I'll also set this up with a little example of how I've used AQ. For example, recently did a project with a pharmaceutical company. They had about 200 sales reps. Marketing developed buyer personas for them, but in AQ terminology, they didn't understand necessarily the answers to provide with each of the persona types. So we developed a portfolio of answers that they could draw upon as they talk to each of these persona types. The chief scientist, the chief procurement officer, and they had all these stories and concepts and metaphors that they could use at their disposal. So that was sort of an example of them thinking about these answers when they haven't really done that before. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions. I'm not sure if we're far enough along where real interesting questions are going to be forthcoming, but any questions or comments? No. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on. This material came roughly probably halfway through the slides I prepared to give you an idea. My research we did research with the top golf instructors in the world, as rated by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine, in case you're interested, to develop the original research. And we studied these golf instructors for 2 reasons. One, they were experts. They were in the upper half of the 99th percentile of their profession. Always good to study experts. And second, they taught a wide range of clients. So everything from touring pros on TV to weekend warriors to your son and daughter picking up the golf clubs for the first time. And that was important because if you think of the conversations you have and the questions and answers that are exchanged, there oftentimes are these asymmetries, people that know less than you, know more than you, more interested, less interested. And essentially they use all these questions and answers across all the different client types. So it would generalize to potentially any conversation you might have. So I'm going to give you some examples of each of these answer types, and then we're going to really focus on story a little bit more, and I'll open it up for the group. Okay, so I'm going to give you one example of each of these answer types. So imagine you're a leader and you have a new person working for you. Either explicitly or implicitly, they're going to ask you, what is leadership to you? They want to know what you view leadership as. And as a leader, you need to be able to articulate this. So this can be answered with a concept. For example, I could define leadership and break it down and say, leadership is inspiring others and holding people accountable. Okay, that gets at a concept. We could define it and break it down more precisely, but I think you get the idea. People that understand ideas can break it down, right? If I said, what's employee engagement? If you had no idea what it was, you don't have command of it. But if you could say it's cognitive engagement, thinking about the job, emotional engagement, the company does well, I'm excited, and does poorly, I feel sad, physical engagement, of the stamina to do the job. Now that's an answer that sort of conveys the person understands the concept. So I could answer this with a concept. Then I can also answer with a metaphor. I could say leadership is like two ropes. When the ropes are separate, they're strong. When they're braided together, they're stronger. That's how I lead. I inspire and hold people accountable each meeting. So you can answer, with a concept and or a metaphor. Now we'll go up to our favorite here, story. I'll tell you a very terse story. I interviewed a high-ranking Navy SEAL, went out to Maryland and spent a day with the Navy SEAL, and I asked him, why are you successful? And he proceeded to tell me the following story. He talked about a capture or kill mission in the Philippines. Some locals were beheaded, and the Navy SEALs were brought in to get the bad guys. So as it happened, they went to approach the hut of the village elder, and they drove their heavily armored Hummer. They approached the hut. Our Navy SEAL got out of the Hummer and proceeded to take off his body armor. Then he walked directly into the hut, sat next to the village elder, and they had a nice conversation. Several short weeks later, the village elder gave over the names of the bad guys. So I would assert this is a terse story. And we can think of story elements that I could have expanded upon more, but there was drama, life or death was involved. Round characters, you get a sense of maybe who this person was beyond the story, be a real person. Reversal, there's a setting, sort of, etc. So we understand what stories are. Now I'm going to bring in theory. So theory is cause and effect logic. And if we think of the story I just told you, it also involves concepts. It's built upon concepts, which I'm not highlighting in the colored space here, but I'll give you a rhetorical question. Which of these concepts was most central to the story I just told? And money is economic, and involvement's a social anchor, and then in between. I'll give you a second to think about that, and I'll tell you what the Navy SEAL said. So the Navy SEAL said status. Okay, he believed that if you provide status to others, it leads to success. And if we go back to the story, there were two examples of status that occurred. When the Navy SEAL drove up and got out of his Hummer, what did he do? He took off his body armor, right? He was leveling out status differentials because the village elder didn't have any kind of fancy equipment like that. Second, the Navy SEAL sat directly next to the village elder. In Philippine culture, important people sit next to each other compared to like Western culture where they sit opposite, sort of boardroom style. And this is important as a theory, cause and effect logic, because imagine if you're a Navy SEAL training others. And, our Navy SEAL told me that a lot of the SEALs get it wrong. And there are arguably more money spent on Navy SEAL training than any other person in the world, perhaps. But Navy SEALs get it wrong. He talked about some Navy SEALs would do the opposite. They would just, sort of from a status standpoint, they'd leave their body armor on because they didn't want to get shot at, and they would sit opposite the person. So this is important, I think, from a story perspective, because the stories have morals, but the moral of the story, but theory sort of makes it more explicit. And when you're working in a business setting in particular, you have to show both the story and the theory. And the theory has its own elements. There is drama within the theory. There's different resources one could choose. So this is an example of theory and cause and effect logic that's important for a Navy SEAL to provide an answer to. And finally, and I'll come back to story in a second and open it up for some discussion. Then you also have the how question. In this case, we'll have a little fun here. How do you cycle? Or how do you road bike? I have taken up road biking a couple of years ago, and if I was going to ask you, where do you? I'll give you the answer away here, but if you're going to fall down, do you typically fall down when you're learning how to road bike? When in the beginning when you get on, in the middle when you're riding, or at the end when you get off? And they told me I was going to fall when I bought my bike, and the answer is at the end. When we ride a bike that doesn't have pedals of the clip-ons, we're just riding a normal bike. What we do is we take our feet off at the very last second, right before the bike stops. But if you do that on a road bike, you've taken your feet out too late, and you're gonna crash. You're literally gonna fall over and hurt yourself. And so this is an example of a procedure answer, because the procedure involves steps, like baking a cake. The 10 steps to bake a cake are the procedure, and any given step is the action. Well, here we could sequence those actions in a procedure, and basically what we have to do, very simply, is take our feet off the pedals much earlier in the riding in order not to crash. So the problem is really a procedural problem. And if you realize at the last second that, you forgot to take your feet off when you're about to stop, it's too late. You just crashed. So that's a procedure. And additionally, there's actions related to each of these steps. And sort of punctuate this, if I was going to say, how do you cycle faster down a hill? How do you do that? And what action would you use? You might say something like pedal faster. That's an action. You might say change the gears. A really, really good answer is to do something like this. This is called the Superman position. You should have your body flat. And as you go down the hill, the steeper the gradient of the hill, the better the Superman position is, and it makes you more aerodynamic. So if you Google Superman position and cycling, you'll see people that are going way faster than their counterparts that are cycling with their feet on the pedal by doing the Superman position. So that's a key action. So the point of going through all this is that there's different questions, there's different answers, and you want to have command of all these. And just to bring this back to our discussion, and I'll have this open up for discussion momentarily, and I'll talk about this more later, but one of the qualities of high quality answers is you can transform any given answer into another answer. So I think you might like this. As a group, if we like stories, I would challenge you to say, how does that story transform into the other answer types? I already showed you an example of story going to theory with the Navy SEALs, or a story to concept. This is about value, right? How you provide value to others. You can even talk about procedures and actions. So for example, I took that story, internalized it, and developed and realized it in a real world scenario I was in. Specifically, I was in a downtown Boston high rise waiting for a meeting. And I'd been working the whole night before with a colleague, and we drove in separately. Sort of these, modern sort of fancy chairs that aren't very comfortable. And I was exhausted. I had maybe an hour's sleep. I was sort of laying down in my chair, like, really like that, really bad. And my colleague was standing, and he was right by the elevator. And I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting. He is exhausted too. What is he standing for? And then the CEO came out of the elevator, and my colleague, shook hands with him right away. And I knew right away what happened. And I, asked him later, I said, what was the reason you were standing there and shook his hand? He said he wanted to be ready when the CEO went through the door. And that's an example of status, right? So now the story travels. In the Navy SEAL story, status was about sitting close to someone. In the example I just gave, status was about standing, not sitting. So, it's a ability to take, knowledge, in this case, a concept, and transform it or understand the point of the story and bring it into an executive context about how we wait for people in a meeting in this example. So the point is, each of these answers can be transformed into the other answers. And I think that could be a powerful window to think about the almighty story and then how it could be repurposed in different ways for different business questions. So let me pause there and let's see if we have any discussion about this. I'm hoping this stimulates some conversation.
So when you talk about story, what elements have you found in your research are essential for it to be considered a story rather than a metaphor? Do you look at a difference? Do you differentiate between story and anecdote, or don't you worry so much about those sort of fine-tuned aspects?
No, I do worry about those. I'll say a couple things. Story, in my view, is essentially similar to an analogy. Metaphors and similes I put in the same category. They're sort of from a cognitive perspective on metaphors. The main difference between a metaphor and story is a metaphor is about a singular concept, locating to a concept. Like in my metaphor of the braided rope, it's about leadership. A story has cause and effect logic, and it's dramatized. At its core, a story has a theme. I think the theme is very important to me of what a story is. Story also has attributes, which are going to be ones I'm sure you'd probably agree with. And there's a list that I have that I think are most important. A story has to have a beginning, middle, and end. Story has to have drama, which is reversal. The story needs to involve the setting. So like context matters much more in the story, and it's visceral and it's real. Stories have round characters as opposed to flat characters. So for example, in my story, I could have amped up the round character. I could have introduced my story by saying, let me tell you a story about Blue. It's a story about a Navy SEAL. And anytime a parent names, this is his middle name, anytime a parent gives someone a name that's consistent with the Star Spangled Banner, this person's destined to be a patriot. And the truth was that was his middle name. My delivery there wasn't real good, but you get the point. Round characters, and there might be another element or two, but those are the basic points of a story. Stephen, did I hit on the things you asked? Any follow-up thoughts?
There's lots of different views, perspectives on exactly what a story is. There's probably dozens and dozens of them in all the books I've read and seminars and so on. But so I was just curious, as you have coached people to answer, if you sort of direct them in a specific way as far as answering in a story, basically, I think that at the heart of every story is struggle, that there's unmet desire at the heart of every story, and that you can have, I think a mistake a lot of people make is a list of events occurring. So they'll list a series of events occurring, but they'll never dial into the unmet desire, the intentionality, and the struggle that results from not getting what they want. So to me, I always think about, I always start with struggle and intentionality. I didn't know, that's what I'm saying, how in depth that you get typically with research and so on, or.
My view, the struggle I put into the drama, drama, and I think, I did look at it pretty closely, but one of my interests was to put story into relief with the other answer types. And to understand the stories and metaphors are different. So for example, if you told me the story of Romeo and Juliet, that's a story, right? We know what that is. And I could then say that's like star-crossed lovers. that's a metaphor. So you can transform a story into a metaphor, but they're different. The same way you could do that for any movie or anything you like. And one of the challenges and opportunities, I think, in the AQ framework is to transform any answer type into another answer type. So like you can tell a great story, but can you transform that into a procedure that someone would use for the next meeting, right? And this is very important, for example, in a sales context. There's something that I like to refer to as the economy of answers. If you have a sales meeting, and this probably goes for any meeting, all else being equal, it's better to tell one story than multiple stories. If you have limited time with like someone that's a buyer, if you could tell one story that really gets their attention and then transform that into how that relates to the product, the features and functions, you've really done something. But if you tell a story and then you need another story to talk about your product, then that story wasn't as efficient as it could be. So those are some of the thoughts. And it's really, I think, about expanding and appreciating all the answer types, because when you dramatize something, for example, I think the theory needs also to be explicated. In a room of Navy SEALs, if you just told the story and you didn't provide the theory and sort of get into that, the theme might be lost on people. And it's a good way to sort of stress test your story. Do they have the same theory? Does the theory relate to the story? But now I'm sort of rambling here, but anyone else want to jump in with comments or questions?
2 questions. My first question is, in this hexagonal model that you're showing us here, does it mean anything in particular that 2 of these kinds of answers are adjacent to one another or opposite to one another in the
Yes.
circle?
Yes, it does. And this is I'll talk about that upcoming, but I'll just say shortly, this is a circumplex structure. It's a particular circular ordering of variables where adjacent answers are most related and opposite are least related. So, for example, someone is asking you how to do something, procedure and action complement each other, right? It'd be very frustrating, perhaps, if you gave a story when someone really just wanted to know, how do I screw this bolt on, right? That's a great story about, the history of bolts and, how a bolt is important in construction, but, I'm having trouble with this bolt. Can you please help me? I want to know how to fix this bolt. So we'll get into that, and maybe I could jump to that now. But maybe I could push forward and then we can have extended discussion. How's that sound? Okay.
Sounds great.
So here we go, right there, Andres. So there are 6 high AQ practices, and they all evolve around the circular structure. And so high AQ practice 0, which actually is not in my book. I had 5 and I decided to add a 6th one. So I put old consulting trick. You can always add a zero step. But it's question recognition. As you know, for those that have had young children or have been a young child, sometimes they ask the same question and has different meaning. How, and sometimes they mean what, sometimes they mean why. So an important thing to note is that question recognition is mapping it to the technical framework. Was this a why, what, or how question? And then providing the appropriate answer for them. So for example, I was working with a sales organization, executive buyers that were really asking the why questions, even if they were implicit. Why should I buy from you? Tell me how it relates to my business strategy, my theory or story. And the buyers in the selling organization were interpreting these as how questions. And they were basically saying, well, let me tell you about the features and functions of our product, our SaaS software. And the buyers were getting frustrated. It's because we're not listening to the questions being asked. So this is, be true of, so story is not always the most appropriate answer. That being said, really powerful answers of any answer type can often satisfy questions that are even, not directly aligned. I'll just sort of leave that out there. So that's question recognition, which is really important. Next is high AQ practice 1. It's the idea there are 6 answers, and can you provide the best answer as appropriate? So like the metaphor is a target. If you have no target to aim at, you're not going to hit the target. The chances go down, right? But if you have a target, you can hit it. So if we know there are 6 answers, you can prepare before a presentation. You can think of your value proposition for your organization. And then when the time comes and there's a specific question, it's a what question, you think they want a metaphor, you deliver. So that's important. Next, and then, for example, I had a student in my book who I coached on interviews, and she made a point of providing 6 answers for her number 1 soft skill. And she would do that intentionally every single interview because she wanted them to know what her candidacy was. And by the way, she got the job, and I was told she was one of the best, communicators they've ever had interview. Truth is, she was an excellent candidate, but she sort of understood these techniques, including this and some others she used. The next one, which starts to get to the circular structure, is a little bit more is answer twice. So for important why, what, and how questions, you want to answer twice to sort of metaphorically appeal to the left and right side of the brain. Logical answers, theory, concept, and procedure, as well as emotional answers, story, metaphor, and action. So like I said before, what is leadership? I could define it, inspiration, accountability, and give the braided rope metaphor, and do it all in combination. So it really locks home the answers. You can do that for any of the important why, what, or how questions. If you have a story, make sure you make the theory explicit. And then, anyways, so, what is a trusted advisor? Just to explicate this, I had a consulting firm partner that said they define trusted advisor as someone that did more than 2 lines of business with them. Okay? You may disagree or not, but that's a definition. That's good. And as a metaphor, the trusted advisor is we're the 3rd card in the Rolodex behind the accountant and lawyer, and then there's us. Okay, now that's command of what trusted advisor is, as opposed to sort of vacuous understanding. And you deliver it twice, someone's really going to get it. Then we have provide compliments. So this gets to the circular structure, Andres, that you were getting at. Adjacent answers tend to complement each other. I already gave you the Romeo and Juliet. If someone provided a story, can you transform it into a metaphor? Equally so, really powerful. If someone tells you a story, can you transform it into a metaphor? Sometimes if someone provides a story and we provide a story, it could be like one-upmanship. But if you provide a metaphor, you're translating it in a new way, different area. It can sort of move the conversation along in a very deferential way. Opposite answers can resist each other. And you'll see this with story and procedure. So imagine if you went to see the movie of Julia Child, right? And we want to see story. But then you get there and there's nothing but recipes flashing on the screen. Those are basically procedures. Most of us would walk out unless we really love Julia Child and all the answers she has. So that's the point. So similarly, if someone is really interested in a why question, you deliver a procedure, it might not come off well, or vice versa. If they want to know how to do it and you're just focusing and pontificating on stories, that might not be appropriate. And then there's also styles. So I imagine everyone here in this room is red. You prefer stories and metaphors, arguably. Others are going to be analytical. They prefer theories and concepts. Others will be practical and prefer procedures and actions. So the idea is to understand yourself so you can amplify what you think is important, what you're good at, but also know your weaknesses and know how to connect to others. So speaking about myself, my style is very analytical. That's my number 1, relational number 2, and practical number 3. And when I was teaching before AQ, I would not have textbooks. I was, not very practical. I would have them read academic articles for undergraduates. And, not surprisingly, they didn't like it. But I didn't see it. To me, it just seemed like a good way to do it. And finally, answer in context is the when and where. And here's the idea that all 6 of the answers need to reflect the context. That means they may be consistent across context or they may vary, but they must reflect the context. So for example, stories. If you're telling a story perhaps it's a story that appeals to everyone, right? That could be true, but then there might be a group where one story is more important. Julianne's going to the women's conference. Maybe there's a particular story for that group, as opposed to, if you went to the men's conference, just to point that out. May or may not be the same with the answers, so you have to understand the context. And this really gets, I think, going from checkers to chess potentially. So let me stop there and really have time for some extended discussion. These are all my slides I prepared. I have a final slide, sort of contact information, but let me open it up. I'll just put, the circle here, just so we can see the circle. So who would like to jump in? Very curious in your thoughts, comments, questions, push back, push forward, etc.
My second question was, what about who?
Yeah, that's great. The who is imbued in the other questions and the answers. Who should ask the questions? Who should provide the answers? And then you could also say the who is, to amplify that, it's for example, imbued in the answers. We're developing a DISC AQ assessment we're going to market with. You have your depending on how you look at personality, let's call it personality. Your personality should be reflected in the answers that you hold dear to yourself. And to really amplify that, there's been research on stories like homo narratus, next to language itself, the defining attribute that makes us humans, our ability to story the world. Narrative therapy says we are our stories that are central to us. Concepts and theories, we are the mental models that are essential to us. Procedures and actions that relate to that. Habit research, we are the habit answers we have. So the answer there is the who is imbued with the questions and answers.
You've given us a lot to think about. Yes. Yes.
Does the book discuss these high IQ practices?
It does. The book has 3 parts. The first part is sort of overview, getting into things. The second part are the 5 high IQ practices, clearly outlined. And the third part is co-authored chapters on different topics like sales AQ, marketing AQ, or actually call it brand AQ, physician AQ, coaching AQ, and a couple others.
Ryan, do you have an example of working with a client or client group where using this methodology was a change maker that surprised the group more and you and what came out of it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of the impact, like a framework like this, I think can be subtle. For example, an executive coach was working with his client, and in a lot of settings, as probably all of you know, communication is often an issue, and particularly for executive coaching, it tends to focus on communication. And this coach, had the client buy the book, and they were working through the book and thinking through the framework, and the client had a meeting with his CEO in Greece, and he needed to convey there were regulatory problems in Greece. So absent AQ and sort of not thinking about it, I guess the client's reaction was, I need to put together, 30 slide PowerPoint deck. So we know that's not a good idea for a 15-minute meeting and for all kind of reasons, but this is what happens in the real world, right? It's these sort of really bizarre ways we try to communicate. And the coach said to him, let's remember AQ. What are we trying to say? What's the question? What are the regulatory challenges was the key question. They wanted to focus on a metaphor, and they developed together a metaphor of a pinball machine. And they said the situation in Greece is like a pinball machine. The ball is going to bounce around. If we lean in the wrong way, the machine's going to go on tilt. So for a lot of other reasons, this made sense. The executive client, delivered this metaphor in the meeting with the female CEO. She got it in the first 30 seconds and said she got it. And then they proceeded to talk about other answers in AQ terms. And not only did the metaphor work in that meeting, but guess what? It traveled. The CEO then used that same metaphor in a subsequent meeting. And the point here is that we all use answers, but we don't use them deliberately. And this is a framework to sort of, harness sort of communication in a more deliberate way. So the takeaways are all these answers are important. Another takeaway is don't forget about metaphors. I think they're one of the most underappreciated areas. And the third related point for this group is if we all love stories, the brother of stories is metaphor. They both connect emotionally and sort of add metaphors explicitly to your command. Metaphors answer a different question. There are advantages of metaphors that I don't think are fully appreciated by many. And those are, they're more economical. They're easier to tell. They require less in the delivery. and there's a lot of advantages. So to wrap this up, I think that's an example of a real life scenario, and a lot of the benefits of AQ are very subtle. And I'll give you one other application, and then I'll pause. For your next meeting, important meeting, think about developing 6 answers for whatever the topic is. And as a general rule of thumb, if you have all 6 answers, you've really thought through the solution. Because there are risks when we get in meetings, just to pick on stories, that become story fest, and everybody tells stories back and forth, and we don't really move forward. We have the illusion of moving forward, and we only know if we move forward if we triangulate that against all the other answer types and begin to stress test and figure out which stories really hold the day. So those are 2 examples.
Thank you. Having worked with a lot of engineers and lawyers over time, they were always great thinking prompts. So I love this visual of reminding us who might be in the room and how people listen and how to engage those components. So it's a good thinking prompt.
I think it is. And, this does, engineers like this. We're doing a lot of work around where poor communicators need a framework. We're doing some work around neurodiversity. So helping neurodiverse communicate with others and communicate with those that are neurodiverse. And it also relates to any content area too. You can think of, we need to sort of think through the content of these 6 answers so you can apply it to sort of any area you're interested in.
Hey, Brian, I have a question, really just wondering if you could comment on, originally I was thinking that most of what this would relate to was kind of explicit questions that people might ask and how we respond to it. And then I heard you talk about implicit and actually trying to figure out what people are talking about. But I've also noticed a lot of it is kind of anticipatory, like thinking ahead, and the question hasn't even arisen yet, but like the person waiting at the elevator, there wasn't a question there, but that was kind of making an impression, and it fits in there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a good observation. So it definitely is implicit. And this can tie into more conventional approaches towards communication. Think nonverbals. So if I'm telling a story and you start smiling, that's giving me a clue that you like stories. I'm gonna feed you maybe more stories. Or if you start frowning, that maybe means I thought you were asking or interested in a why question, but you're not interested in that. You want to know maybe a what question, more basic, or a how question. So it's about implicit questions, and the idea that ultimately, very reductionistic view that conversations are nothing but question and answer exchange. It's about knowledge transfer. So that's the first thing about the implicit questions. And what was the other part of your question?
Of kind of the anticipatory.
Oh, yeah. So I think there's 2 things. One, in a lesser form, it could be scripted, and that's sort of not good. But in a broader form, it can be anticipatory. And I think maybe the closest corollary here is we've done some work with Second City alum, improv. And they talk about improv as you prepare, and then you have rules of engagement during the improv, which are things like yes and, you don't say yes but, you keep the conversation going forward. So the same way, AQ can become an operating framework for a conversation. And if someone's really focused on the hows, then you can anticipate maybe, do they understand the what, right? We're talking about, how you should lead, but do they know what leadership is? So you can anticipate, you can begin to think about moving people around. So there is that element. And, I think, I don't know if this was explicitly done, but I think with that elevator story, you could probably think of it this way. What can I do to show this person that I respect them, right? Oh, I'm going to stand up and wait by the elevator, right? It doesn't have to be that mechanical, but I think you can anticipate. And like, I'll give you another example with anticipation. With this recent project I did with the pharmaceutical company, when the marketing team talked to the sales team didn't want to hear the stories and stuff up front. They wanted to know, give me the facts right up front. But the marketing people wanted to sort of have the stories and build toward the stories at the end. So it's about anticipating where in the conversation maybe different answers might be received better, and to risk of saying too much, integrating with personality. I was just had a conversation with a high D person, and they like to get just to the point. And we were talking that if I was providing stories to him, he wouldn't like that. He'd get very antsy. He wants to know where we're going with this. And, stories can maybe come later, but he really wanted to, focus on like procedures or actions. So I need to anticipate, the tempo of the person. So anyways, those are some thoughts. Tom, in response to my rambling remarks there?
No, it's interesting to listen to, and I didn't have an expectation of what you would say, so thanks. I do have one other question of, would you put emotion as one of the imbued in all of it as well? I mean, because often when I listen to how someone answers, they could tell a story that might be mildly interesting, but if they tell it with emotion and passion and feel the story as they share it, their answer becomes much more compelling to me than if they tell it in a just kind of dry, impartial way.
Yeah, I think the emotions are part of it, and at some point, the framework does break down. I don't want to say it like dovetails with everything, but I'll just say this: like, story and metaphors are about making emotional connections. They're not logical connections. Like that example I told about the Navy SEALs, I could look at a logical connection and look at like meta-analyses and statistics and what drives status and all that. But then we have the story, which is an emotional connection, and you relate it to other experiences you have. So I think there are sort of centers of gravity of like emotion and logic and other sort of aspects. But that being said, this is a circular structure, so there are no pure form answers. So emotions travel elsewhere. Case in point, I was in a doctoral seminar at one point, and this professor from Hong Kong came in, and he showed this mathematical model on the board. And he literally said to the group, "It is so beautiful. It should be hanging in the Art Institute of Chicago." He was emotionally excited. So the point is, to make this maybe even more palatable for you, there's a quote that says, "Ideas change the world." That's a concept, right? We get excited about concepts. Well, he was getting excited about concepts in theory, in emotionally laden way. So I think, it's possible to evoke emotions everywhere, and it can be difficult, but it can be done.
Thank you.
What other questions or comments, particularly any like practical suggestions or questions that would be good? I want to make sure everyone has a takeaway here that they can use this or think about it.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the idea of preparing 6 answers?
Yeah. So the 6 answers, you got to start someplace. You can start anywhere. A lot of times when I'm working with a client, I'll start with story. As you know, most people can consume stories very well. They like to go to the movies. And so you start there. And then what I would often do is say, let's see if we can transform that story into every other answer type. If we can't, then the original answer may not be the right answer. And ultimately, what you get to is a portfolio of answers, where you can have 2 or 3 exemplar stories. You have your theory and concepts, procedures and actions, and metaphors. And it's just thinking through the topic. Like for me with AQ, I it's a framework for others, but I use it on myself. So for me, if I put in the center of the wheel, it's sort of influence. So, what is influence to me? Answers provide influence as a theory and concept. What are, how do you define an answer? I could do that, break it down into the 6 answer types. Then I have metaphors. I've shared with you, 6 answers as a target, but then I have other metaphors I could use to explain AQ. Then I have procedures and actions, which are essentially the 5 high IQ practices. So whatever your topic is, so for example, I had a client out of Thailand that wrote a book on teams. So his challenge was to think through teams in terms of 6 answers. And, for example, his book, and he eventually, developed a metaphor around teams, around engines, different types of engines. And he was really thinking through his material. So the short answer here is you sort of apply yourself to each of these answers, usually start in one place, and it takes time to really think through the answers. I've done this with like sales organizations and their value proposition, and they start the exercise as a group, and there's usually big holes in their answers, and they really need homework and to think through what they're trying to convey. Does that help, or at least add some more detail, Andres?
Yes, thank you.
So, Martin? Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go, Stephen, and then I think you will be the last question, and then we'll move on to closing and asking Brian some important questions at the end.
Okay, great. It'll be quick, but I appreciate your presentation. And so if very often if we're presenting, let's say at a corporate event or something, there might be a time where the people who've invited us want to do a Q&A at the end. They want to do a question answer type program. And so if that's the case, when people ask a question, or when you've been in those types of situations like you are right now, Q&A, but are you trying to gauge from the way that the person asks the question how it would be most appropriate to answer it? Or are you just doing kind of what instinctively at this point comes to mind? How do you evaluate when someone asks a question in that sort of a context, where to go with your response?
Yeah, I think like any skill, it's subtle. So, I may have had a whole hour of discussion. I've had nonverbals where, people were wildly excited, about why we're doing this or not. And then I have the focal person asking the question. So you'd sort of interpret it, and based on the context of what they say, it may be clear, which question type it is. I could ask them, use meta conversation and say, oh, that's a nice question. It sounds like you want me to provide you a story. Is that what you would like? And then they say yes or no. They say, no, I don't want a story. I want to know the steps, how this works, and you just answer. So I think it's no different than the metaphor here is like sports. We have dribbling and passing and shooting off the backboard. And we sort of know when we might need to use the backboard, but in the real game situation, we sort of improvise. If there's a 7-foot center coming, then I'm going to, I don't know, I'm going to shoot it some other way. And it's subtle, but I will say that I think having the framework, at least for me, gives me a crutch that allows me to be, let's say if there's a 10-floor building, I can get to the 6th floor and feel really comfortable about Q&A. And maybe there's a couple more floors up that are more subtle and based on experience, but that's true for any kind of communication. But it's a crutch that at least helps me feel more competent.
Brian, can you put your last slide in where it has your contact information?
Yes.
And where we can find you in the world? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love the insight that you shared about how to find out what people need. I even had this example come to mind where a top manager was caught in the Q&A session with a difficult question, and the guy from the audience, he didn't even ask the question. He was just furious, and the top manager was like, okay, so you want to know why we're doing this or how we're doing this or both? And the guy was like, yeah, both, please. And how, and more details on how. And it was like exactly as you said. So he clarified what the aggression was all about, what was the misunderstanding. Brian, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Share with us, apart from the context, maybe some of your projects or something you've been working on or will be working on, so we can, put a spotlight on you.
Yeah. So just to amplify something I already mentioned, I'm doing a DISC AQ application for people to communicate their personality or behavioral tendencies. Then we're applying AQ in a lot of interesting ways, like for safety AQ in the aviation space, diversity, equity, inclusion, neurodiversity, as well as more conventional spaces like leadership and sales. So those are some of the things that are focused on right now. I'll also say, if anyone goes to my website, there's a free Explore AQ test you can take that gives you a 10-page PDF report. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to take that.
Terrific. And Artem, in our last minute, and thank you, we'll be in touch. We like to make sure that we have our speakers revisit us in various different capacities as time goes on. Artem, why don't you tell us a little bit about May?
Yes.
So it's the focus, the lens is on you.
With pleasure. So for May, we don't have a specific SIO lab. Instead, we are doing a huge conference. Instead of one speaker, we are having 3 days of content in different time zones, and it will be from 18th till the 20th of May. And the topic of the conference is Storyfy Your Culture. So this year, we're focusing all about how to work with stories on values, on purpose, on mission statement, onboarding practices, leadership practices for culture building, and et cetera, et cetera. So you'll be seeing an invitation. So please feel free to join. It's an absolutely free event for everyone, and share with anyone you'd like to.
This is Artem's brainchild too, that he came up with, and has been generous in sharing and inviting us in into another segment of the story world internationally. So yes.
I hope we can prove by doing this event that we are more about stories and human beings inside of us than some stuff that divides us. So yeah, thank you for.
It's a gift. It's a gift. Well, we are at 12:59. So look at all the information we managed to tuck in there. Please invite other people to these these sessions and workshops, especially up and coming emerging professionals who are always great source of voices and perspectives. And anybody who's they're not involved in storytelling per se, we all use it, whether we realize it or not. As Brian was saying and Artem is saying, metaphors show up in our conversation stories, and it does connect us in beautiful ways. So until the next time, send us your ideas, your suggestions, who else we could be talking to out there in cyberspace, and knocking on their door to say, by the way, you don't know us yet, but you will in a minute. So until that time, be safe and be well, and have a beautiful day. All right. Cheers, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.